Hello. Today we are going to learn a little bit about copyright law in order to help prepare you for your project that you're working on with your classroom teacher. So, as we get started, and I kind of go through and explain to you what copyright law is and its effects on us as students and teachers, but also as people in society, I want you to take out the guided notes that I handed you and use those as a way to sort of fill in the information as we go along. When we get to the end of the lecture, after I'm all done, then you will have a few minutes on your own to summarize what we've talked about to kind of share that you understand all of the important things about copyright law. So let's get started. First of all, I think the big question is, what is copyright? What does that mean? Well, copyright, by definition, is the rules that determine how an original work can be used and copied. What does that really mean, though? What that means is when a work is created, the person who is responsible for creating that work, the artist or the writer or whomever, deserves to be compensated for what they've created. That compensation may come by them being given credit for what they've done. It may mean that they get paid for what they have done, but some sort of combination of those two. It's the idea that you can't take someone else's creation material and then just use it without compensating them for it. And it's a serious crime, as we'll get to. It's not something that's to sort of be ignored and so that's no one's ever going to notice, right? That's not the kind of attitude that we should have. I want you to think about if you spent time creating something, say a work of art, or you wrote a paper, or you choreographed a dance, or you wrote a piece of music, you did something, you created something, you spent hours and hours that you were very passionate about creating this thing. And then someone else just takes what you've created and starts distributing it to other people, and your name might not even be on it. You're not getting paid for all of the hard work that you did. None of that. So I want you to think about that as we're going through the idea of copyright. Why it's important? Why is it relevant? Because number one, I think first and foremost, it's important to give people credit to for what they've done and what content they've provided to the rest of us. Whenever we work, whether it's for joy or because it's our job, whenever we put our heart and soul into something, we want to know that we're going to get something in return. And that's kind of where copyright stems from. So let's look a little bit as far as what kinds of works are copyrighted. First of all, we have probably most commonly printed materials. So those could be things like books and short stories and poems and plays and articles and magazine articles and newspaper articles and all kinds of stuff. Something that's printed and written down. Another thing would be something that's considered performance art. So that's not necessarily something that's going to be a piece of art that you would take home and hang on your wall, but that's going to be something you could view. So that would be a movie or a TV show, a sound recording like a podcast, a musical, or works of music. So that could be the lyrics to songs, but it can also just be the sound of the music itself, an instrumental piece. So all of those things are included under the category of performance art. Then we have what we consider to be sort of more regular art, pictures, graphics, sculptures, comic strips, memes, I guess, in some ways, anything like that where someone has spent time creating something that's a visual. I think number four is probably one of the most important things, though, is that everything on the internet falls under copyright unless it says otherwise. So we automatically assume, no matter what, that if we find something on the internet, that it falls under copyright. If it says otherwise, which we'll talk about in a minute, what that could look like, then we know that we can use it without having to seek permission or to compensate the person who created the work. But otherwise, we have to go under the assumption that yes, everything in the internet is something that is copyrighted. Some things that are not protected by copyright law, because there are those too. Now, I'm going to ask you, what might we notice about all the things that are listed in those 6 boxes right there? I'll tell you in a second, but I want you to kind of ponder that as I'm going through them. So some things would be ideas. Some things could be discoveries. Some things could be useful articles. Now, you might be saying to yourself, what's a useful article? A useful article would be things like lamps or couches or notebooks. It's not like there's one person who says, well, I invented the spiral bound notebook and no one else can have spiral bound notebooks. That's not what that is. It's a useful article. It's something that everyone's going to use. There may be different types of it that are created, but that's not something that's protected by copyright law. Another thing would be titles. So just strictly the title of a work is not something that's copyrighted. You can reference the title of a work without having to pay the author for referencing the title. Another thing would be names. So people's personal names or the names of cities, those things are not under copyright. And then finally, short phrases. So short phrases, that's a tricky one because it's things that aren't associated. So short phrases are short phrases. They could be things that we say commonly or maybe something that's just sort of fun. So for example, there was a TV show a couple of years ago where one of the characters, his catchphrase was the phrase bazinga, and that's what he said all the time. So just because that was that character's catchphrase bazinga, that's a word that's like regular in words in everyday language. Like that's not something that's specifically created for that character. And so because of that, we can use the term bazinga without then having to reference the character every single time. However, some phrases are phrases that are attached to corporations. Like if you think about Nike and Just Do It, that's their slogan. So a slogan, a little different than a short phrase because it's associated with a company. So there's sort of a little bit of a difference there between those two. The answer to the question, of course, or what common things can we see among all of these, is that they are not tangible in their expression. So you'll notice there's nothing that is physical to them. Useful articles is probably the closest thing that's physical, but even that, it's not one particular couch, right? Like again, couches are just things that are helpful and useful. So there's many of them. So we don't have to worry about copyright for that. So then you might be saying to yourself, but what can I use then, Mrs. Cheragino? What do I use? How can I incorporate anything into my presentation? Well, there's lots of things that you can use. The first thing you can use is anything that is considered to be in the public domain. And if you don't know what the public domain is, that's okay. We're going to go over it here in a minute. But the first thing is if anything is in the public domain. The second thing is anything you have permission to use. So if there's something that you really, really wanted to use within a work that you were creating, a presentation for class, or if you were creating your own piece of art and you wanted to use someone else's stuff in it, you were making a video and you want to include a movie clip, you could seek permission to use that movie clip. You can also use anything that falls under the fair use policy, which we'll also get to in a minute. And then something from the internet that can be used with a Creative Commons license. And we're going to go into that too. So as you can see, I'm kind of previewing for you here where we're going to go in the next few minutes. The last thing to remember, though, is that if you are going to get permission to use something, the permission has to come from the creator, not from your teacher, not from your mom or dad. It's going to come from the person who created it in the first place. All right, so I mentioned to you public domain. What is the public domain? There are materials in the public domain that aren't protected by intellectual property laws like copyright. So something that's in the public domain is considered to be owned by the public. So how does a work get here? Well, it could be that there was something, a written work, say a book or a short story or a poem or something like that. So we'll pick a short story for our example. So the writer for the short story got it published, they had the copyright, but they didn't renew the copyright properly. So after a certain amount of time, you have to renew your copyright on what you've created. And they didn't do it properly. They didn't do it on time. They didn't turn in their papers, whatever. So if that doesn't happen, then that short story could become part of the public domain. Another thing could be that the copyright owner dedicated the work. So you could have someone who created art or a short story. Again, we'll go with short story. And the author, at some point says, you know what, I just want everyone to enjoy this and be able to reference it and use it in whatever form of expression they want. And I don't want to have to make any money off of it or be credited for it in any way anymore. So I'm going to dedicate it to the public domain, and they can do that. The last thing could be that the copyright has expired, and there's different rules for that because sometimes, depending upon when the work was published originally or when it was created originally, there are different rules in place for those things. So I'm not going to get into those finer details right now, but if you're finding something and you're not sure about whether or not the copyright has expired and whether or not it's considered to be within the public domain, you can always ask your teacher or your friendly librarian. So if you wanted to seek permission, you're making a video, you must have this one movie clip from Disney to be a part of it. How do you seek permission? First of all, you have to identify the copyright owner. Could be a major movie studio like Disney, could be a smaller artist. You have to identify them. You then have to request permission and get physical evidence saying that you have permission. And then you also negotiate the terms of use. Are you going to pay them? How much are you going to pay them? Or is it just simply enough to give them credit? You have to figure that out with them individually. I also mentioned to you fair use. So teachers and students sometimes have exceptions to copyright law, but we have to consider some things. What's the purpose? From a teacher perspective, are we teaching with it? Are we trying to sell it to people? Because selling, not okay. Teaching could be okay. What kind of work is it? Is it appropriate to the lesson that we're using? How much of it are we using? Are we using one paragraph from a short story, or are we trying to use an entire collected works of short stories? The biggest question is, would it be taking sales away from the creator? So are we robbing the person who created this of the opportunity to earn their living? And that's probably one of the biggest things. So that's why we can't just have, photocopies of a novel for English class. You have to go out and purchase the novel itself, because if we just made photocopies on the printer, that would be taking away the ability of the author to get money for their creation. So no matter what, though, we still have to cite our sources. Then we have the Creative Commons license. Sometimes creators give limited permission to use their works, images, videos, audio, all kinds of things like that. And I've left hyperlinks there on those two underlined words, the here and the Creative Commons website. So you can go there. Those are things that people have created and given Creative Commons license to and say, here, you can use these. It's fine. Just give me credit. I don't mind. And so there's things that you can do, you can pull from there too to use. One question I get sometimes is, what's the difference between copyright infringement and plagiarism? Copyright infringement is when you use someone else's work and you use it in such a way when you're creating something else. Plagiarism is when you take someone else's work and you pass it off as your own. So that's the difference between those two. Both are wrong, but they aren't the same. Why is this a big deal? So taking someone else's creation or material is stealing. You can be fined hundreds or thousands of dollars. And most importantly, as we mentioned, it's important to pay people for their work. So what steps should you take? What should you do? Don't run to a resource that you already know is copyrighted. If you're already saying to yourself, well, there's this cool Disney movie, don't go there. Okay, see what else you can find. Check for copyright. Look at the Creative Commons site as a way to find good sources. And then seek out sources that are in the public domain. That should kind of be your roadmap for what you should do. All right, so what now? So now you are going to create a checklist to use while working on your presentation. You will complete this assignment in groups of 2 or 3. So this is going to show me that you understand what copyright law is and how it can be followed, and making sure that you don't step beyond the bounds that you should. Some requirements for your checklist: you'll need to define copyright law at the top of the page. Your checklist needs to have at least 10 criteria to consider, such as, does this resource have a Creative Commons license? That would be an example of one criteria. Your checklist needs to cover at least 2 types of relevant media, so print and visual or something to that effect. Your checklist needs to demonstrate that you understand the kinds of materials covered by copyright law. And then finally, you will use your checklist to evaluate the materials used in your presentation for your classroom teacher. So once you put it together, you're actually going to go ahead and use this checklist for your own presentation. Thank you very much for your attention and learning everything that I just told you about copyright law. Remember, if you're confused, if it's something that you're unsure of and you don't know whether you're following the copyright law, remember, it's always better to ask. Always so much better to ask than to ask for forgiveness. So ask ahead of time. Best of luck on your checklists. Thank you for your attention today.